So, deep thoughts about distinctions. Any deep thoughts? Yes, right.
I think like my whole list is like biased towards me. Like there's no actual thing that distinguishes these things. They seem to be on a spectrum.
Can you read some of them? Would you mind?
Love, hate, warm, cool, light, dark. I put 0 and a 1. Yes, no, life and death, 2D, 3D, organic, inorganic.
Okay, so why do you say they're all reflected towards you?
Because I'm making like where I feel like I'm making I'm distinguishing the thing. I don't know. Is there an actual thing that's distinguishing?
True.
Where warm ends and where cool starts?
So remember, good philosophical question. If you were supposed to have read The Knife and the One, yes, you read it. So one question is, who owns the knife? And another question is, are these distinctions made or are they discovered? Are they created or discovered? There's no easy answer for this, and philosophers have been debating this since the ancient Greeks, and we still don't. And there are various sides. But yeah, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about that today. Ryan's making a very interesting point, very interesting question. Is she making these distinctions? Is she creating them, or are they already there? Yeah. Amy.
I was just going to ask Ryan, when you said inorganic or organic, were you thinking in terms of like farming, or were you thinking in terms of like organic chemistry under the contained carbon?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I was thinking of organic.
Like, yeah, chemical, okay, so there's the whole like, there's a big kind of debate around what constitutes organic right now, and like, you know, organic fruits, and I don't know, just kind of think some of the maybe people need a distinction about like, you know, how things are marketed.
Right. So Ryan gave us one thought about distinctions. Are they there, or do we make them? What's another thought you might have noticed from your list or in talking to your peers? Sophie.
I started making the list by doing a lot of opposites, and then I started to realize that distinctions are not opposites, and most of them are actually not opposites. And so then we were talking with each other, and we were like, well, basically like anything to a distinction, like just the distinction between like a desk and the floor, like just everything's a distinction.
Did you hear that, Alex?
It's infinite. The lists are infinite.
Exactly.
And then we started getting into like, you can make really small distinctions, like the distinction between like me when I'm hungry and me when I'm full, or like it just goes forever.
You're so right?
Yeah.
Everything is, or maybe everything requires a distinction.
Yeah. Because you couldn't even really see anything without distinctions, or even just, you couldn't do anything without distinguishing between things. You couldn't walk.
Yes, you've just discovered a very deep point. That is genuinely 2 deep thoughts we've had so far. Wow, that's great. Yes, distinctions are everywhere. The colors of the rainbow, musical sounds, tones, silence and music, etc. Good. Yes, Mattia.
What with the concept of being? Like, every single concept implies its opposite.
Yes,
So-
Hegel famously said that. When you name something, you also, when you name something, you're also naming what is not being named.
But naming being, is it really dividing? Because non-being, the existence of non-being,
You want everything, don't you? You're the grand unifier. Yeah.
I mean, the existence of nothing makes it nothing, and its non-existence.
Yes, so perhaps, I mean, this is another deep thought, I will grant you that, about how and you'll see one of my slides, how being, where does nothing fit in here? I'll grant that that's a very hard question. Where does zero fit in? Where does non-being fit in? And again, this is what, I'm not sure I'm understanding your point exactly, but maybe you could say a bit more, I'm not sure. Remember, we're talking about distinctions, we're not talking metaphysics, don't get too philosophical with metaphor. I'm going to pull a positivist card on you, and I want to say you're getting metaphysical, I don't want that in the class. That's easy. Explain.
I think that we can make a distinction between being and non-being only by distorting their supposed meaning. So, for example, we cannot experience nothing, because in order to experience it, it must become anything, something. And it would end to be nothing. In the moment itself, it becomes for me. So it cannot be nothing, because if it becomes something, it's something, it's not nothing anymore.
Are you saying it's not possible to have a non-being?
It's almost contradictory, because it's like experiencing nothing, it's non-experiencing, so.
Yeah, I agree.
So how would you know if you haven't experienced it?
How would you know if you hadn't experienced it?
I mean, it's debatable, you know what I mean? Like,
Okay.
what happens when you're not happy? Exactly.
What did you say? I didn't hear it.
What part?
The last part, where everyone got it.
I don't know what's happening when I'm not happening.
This is hard, Mattia. Could we just set it aside for a moment? Yeah, it's hard. Let's try to be a little more concrete. I'll read one distinction from the show. A couple distinctions that I like. I don't know if these are distinctions. Signal blindness, acumen, speaker, listener, interested, bored. These are good ones. And then armpit flower. That's a good one. Armpit flower. I like it. Eating, starving, philosophy, unquestionable facts. See, Mattia was getting philosophical one. Machine biology. These are good. Ryan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say a comment about, I noticed that as like with distinctions, you're going to have distinctions for sure, right? But where it gets interesting is when you start making value judgments on the distinctions.
That's really deep thought, yes. So I'm going to make slightly paraphrase you. I don't know if you like this. What work does the distinction do, and for what purpose?
Definitely.
Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's an excellent comment. Who and for what purpose, or maybe even to whom? I mean, in legal system, we are filled with trying to figure out how to define. And when you define, you're implicitly using distinctions. Just this morning, I was hearing I'm driving down from San Francisco, hearing a very intense conversation, obviously, about what some people call assisted suicide, other people don't want to call it assisted suicide because it's not really suicide, etc. But then, of course, it gets very quickly into a discussion about distinguishing between suicide and free taking of life, if you're really just taking life for free. So distinctions become very important. The conceptual apparatus becomes very important. Okay? And we do it all the time, and I really appreciate Sophie's sort of just almost the passion with which she just said that it's everywhere. We do it all the time. Yeah, right.
What about the flaws and how we define things?
What are the flaws?
We could agree on what was it, flower and armpit.
Yeah.
But what
That's a
if
memorable one.
your interpretation or your definition of what that is different than mine?
Good. Yes. Any comments? The man who didn't fill the quiz out. Yes.
I think that's why when I draw distinctions now, and agree with what everyone's saying, is a distinction is bounded and boundless both ways. It's bounded to understand your own meaning, your own value judgment, or your own, like however you perceive it, but it's boundless because it can mean anything to anyone else. Anything.
But anything, no, come on. Anything, I mean, armpit doesn't have that fairly somewhat controlled meaning.
I thought it was one word,
Armpit flower. Maybe. So,
well, they're boundless in value.
totally, okay, I'll grant you they're very flexible, but boundless is a very strong term. That means, you know, a flower could be a table, could be a horse.
Maybe if your like consciousness is like highly altered, like you're like drifting.
Drifting, reading, mystical experience.
Well, that's why I said boundless more in value, like how you value it can be. Like that
yes,
term in itself
good.
can be boundless
That's an interesting.
by everyone else's, how, like,
Right.
how everyone else values it.
And that gets back to Ryan's question. Are you riffing on Ryan's question? Ryan who said, well, there are two Ryans sitting next to him, although spelled differently.
Why?
There is a distinction, two Ryans. The others are the nine, ones with the Y, yes. Ryan asked, what work does a distinction do and for what purpose? And then, what's your name again?
Christian.
Christian is now saying, well, yeah, exactly. So depends on what value system or what you're bringing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's just, it is very philosophical to me, and it's like all connected. I mean, it even goes back to his name.
Mattia?
Yeah, what he was saying, I think what he was saying is,
Mattia Leibniz.
my interpretation, what he was saying is almost you can't know one thing without knowing the other. Like, you can't experience, you can't even distinguish dark if you just lived in pitch black your entire life. I've never even seen light.
Good, good. So let me make a few distinctions, if I may, myself. Let's just, or at least invite you to think about the following. I really like this. Sophie also said something interesting, which is these don't have to be opposites. There is a difference between a distinction and a dualism, right? Dualisms do have to be opposites, like, you know, yin and yang. Like, if you like. I mean, we could say female, male, but that's going to bring in a whole, oh, that's good. I lectured on Simone de Beauvoir this morning, an intro, and that was good. It was intense. It was good. And that's going to, you know, male, female is one of the like most potent, trippy, if you like, dualisms and distinctions that, you know, has a lot of valence behind it, and can be reconfigured and rethought. And it's sort of like the paradigm, as it were, of a dualism. Maybe we'll get to it, but just like I want to avoid being, not being for now, I also would like to avoid female, male for now. Because both of them, just for a minute, because both of them are, I mean, first of all, they get a lot of the limelight. And secondly, they're very hard. Let's try, and people have very strong passions about them, and I'm not sure how much we can, let's just try to do some of the less controversial. Is that?
I wanted to pull something out of my section that we're going to talk about, which is that we have these really central ideas, like we have in, out, and up, down, and all these really like what we call orientational metaphors, and those are kind of metaphors that just emerge from the fact that we have bodies, and those are the ones that we have the hardest time not using because they're like the main distinctions that we start off with.
Good.
So yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, so there you might be using Lakoff and Johnson.
Yeah.
Are you using metaphors in their butt?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's a great book. That we have, that a lot of these distinctions come from our embodied experience. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. That's a nice point. I don't know how to put it up there. Do you have ideas about how to put it up? How could you make a question or something about distinctions out of it? Okay, Ian.
What happens when metaphors become too deeply embedded? Like, it kind of falls
When
under
metaphors become,
super deeply embedded, like it kind of falls under what work does the distinction do? Because it's a very embedded and functional metaphor. So like,
could we say what happens when a distinction becomes embedded?
Yeah, like, or, like, I guess, not what happens in the room, but, you know,
I think it falls under are they created or discovered because
okay.
I need your pen.
it's assuming that like they're discovered through our values. I think
Right.
it falls under.
Right. Actually, that's a good point. Yeah. Oh, this is endlessly interesting. Right. Yeah. What was it's created by the body, but it's really like in the body. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Let me try to just give you a little bit of. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that the same word can have multiple dual pieces. Love, hate, love, fear, love, anger, love, grasping. Well, why love, grasping?
That's a hard one. But it's almost like either you love them or you're going to them.
Okay. Fine, I don't have an opinion on that. If it makes sense to others, that's great. Okay, so we have love, hate, love, fear, love, anger, love, grasping. So there are multiple modalities, multiple dimensions of comparison that any one word can have. That's very interesting. You can make a distinction with the same word in different positions, with different contrasts. That's kind of an interesting point. Do you see that? That was exactly the kind of pattern I was hoping might emerge by you making a list. And you would start noticing, hey, I'm putting love, for example, in many different places. It has multiple dimensions of contrast. Yeah, say your name. Zoe.
I think, like, for example, love, you can compare it to multiple things, but love itself is a spectrum, and there's like multiple loves that you can compare itself to.
Good, good. Love is the other topic.
Well, like, everything has like such a spectrum.
True. Well, actually, yes. So, yeah, distinction versus dualism, but even the poles can have a spectrum. That's right. Even the poles in a distinction can have a spectrum. That's a good point, though. But this is very cool. I'm learning something from all the comments. Yeah. Chelsea.
I just thought of this because you're saying that there's multiple dimensions, so kind of like branch off of that in a way. I was thinking like that opposites or like dichotomies or distinctions or whatever you want to call them, like they don't have to be like definite in
No.
the sense that like sometimes we create them like for the sake of like a sense of like, I don't want to say psychological fluidity, like past and future. Like some could argue that the future doesn't exist, but yet we still say future, even though we could never experience future. And like, you know, we make it up because we have to have something that's like dual with past, even though we don't ever experience future or like know for sure that it exists.
So because we only live in the present, then there's either past or future. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and we create those ideas, like future is a tool for the imagination, and we create it so that, like in language and in thought, we have a sense of fluidity. Because if we're talking about the past, and like what's the tool of that? You know, we have to create something to like, you know, and so it doesn't have to be definite in the sense that it doesn't even necessarily have to exist
I see.
for us to use it.
That's kind of an interesting point. I mean, I'm going to borrow a physics metaphor. There is no magnetic monopole. All magnetism is dipole. You always have a north and a south. You can never have like a single north by itself. There's no magnet. We know this from physics now. There's no magnet that can only be a north as opposed to a south. So maybe like there's no concept that wouldn't imply its dual or its opposite. So if we think about the past with which we have already lived, then we know there has to be something like the future.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. It took me a little while to understand. No, that's very interesting. Did others see that? Yeah. Amanda, then Tanner, and then I should do
Have you ever
literature.
heard that we define everything by what it's not?
Yes, sure.
Kind of like what?
Yes. We define everything by what it's not. Yes. Correct. Tanner.
This was just a random thought that I had, but does anyone ever consider like gravity as kind of like a magnet, like it's like a pull? Like there's only one way that gravity works, or is there a repulsion too? Gravity.
Yes. Right now, we are pretty certain that the big was that was when gravity repelled.
Okay.
It's very weird, I know, but gravity repelled.
So if it's still expanding, then what's making that happen?
Dark energy,
Okay.
which we have no idea what it is, except that we know we have it in our theories because it makes the math work. But we don't know what it is. But good questions. You have a good next. All right. So I'm just going to say, I thought we couldn't get more. So the knife and the one, yes? You have a lot of different knives, a lot of different ways to cut. And then this is the map you've already seen of the entire universe, right? So how do we cut up? And that's Sophie's sort of exclamation, proclamation. Everything involves making a distinction, and yes, it does. Everything involves difference. And we've already made a list, but I thought, I'll get to the list in a second. I want to suggest, I'm going to caricature a bit, but that there might be like two starkly different ways to think about cutting or making a knife. And I think they run very deeply in Western as opposed to Eastern culture. And not solely, but to some extent. Where we could talk about whether we're talking about Descartes or Buddha's knife. Descartes, how many of you have heard of Descartes? Okay, so about half. Descartes is probably one of the single most important philosophers and well-known philosophers. He is credited with, he's the one who was skeptic, mind in a vat, brain in a vat. Let's not worry about Descartes too much. We could talk about his philosophy, but he's the founder of modern philosophy, not Greek philosophy, but modern philosophy. He lived in the 16th century. And he made very strong distinctions between, for example, the mind and the brain, consciousness and body, reason, experience, reason and feeling. And he had what I suggest could be called an either-or picture of distinction, where, we're either talking about the mind or we're talking about the brain. We're either talking about consciousness or we're talking about the body. Or, and I put that or in italics because I don't know whether that should be an exclusive or an inclusive or. For those of you who know logic, know what I meant. Which it could, another way of looking at distinction is to look at overlaps. It's to look at what I will later call interpenetration. It's to look at the way that things can work together and synthesize and become synthetic, and that's a more both and way of thinking. And of course, you see that a lot in Eastern thought. Obviously, with the yin and yang, the black, I should have put it up, the black and white yin and yang symbol that you've all seen, I'm sure. So some examples. The wise mind is where the reasonable mind and the emotional mind fit together, etc. So just keep in mind that when you make a distinction, and I'll say more about it in a bit, there really is this interesting set of questions about, are you separating out the distinction into binaries and into dualisms and into either or do you permit that they can come together? And I'll have much more to say about that in a minute, but I do suggest maybe we could think of it in terms of like Descartes' knife or Buddha's knife. Just any comments? So I want to take a minute and give you a list that I guess I was thinking of, and I'm also inspired by an article down here that you can read. I'll put this up online. Art and science, or art versus science, but I prefer to think of it as art and science. So you have art, you know, itself said in an, represented in an artistic way, and science represented in a, well, artistic and scientific way, because you're using scientific icons. And I'm just going to read some distinctions, okay, between art and science. Biographic versus synonymous. And by the way, art also, I would definitely also include music, okay? So anything artistic, music, theater, not just painting and sculpture, right? I mean, it's anything that's artistic. Biographic, anonymous. Imaginative, factual. Mystical, empirical. Emotive, rational. Narrative, synchronic. Left brain, right brain. Manual, machine. Optional, obligatory. Ornamental, functional. Self, all. Symbolic, real. Worn, whole. Do these distinctions ring true to you, or do you want to contest them? Does it make sense? What's going on? React. John, you have no space. Yeah.
So, I think the right brain, left brain thing is a little bit of an oversimplification. The hemispheres of the brain are nearly identical. There's a few different Broca's and Wernicke's areas are. I forget whether they're only on one hemisphere. I think it's the left one. So I forget which one, but it's a little bit different than what reality is, so to speak. Your brain mostly is very uniform and very symmetrical.
Good. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe some of the distinctions are oversimplified. Then think about what it means to make an oversimplified distinction. Does that mean some of the left brain is in the right brain and vice versa? Or, I mean, some of art is in science and vice versa? Or does it just mean that, you know, this isn't a great conceptualization? Or does it mean that it is a good start to conceptualize, but it's not the whole story? Or is it dangerous? Is it medicine or is it poison? Yeah, Michelle.
It depends on how you, I think it depends on how you get the distinction. Like if you could think of them as just like left and right region.
Hey, let's forget the brain for a second. Yeah, let's leave the brain out for a second. So think of another one.
If you think they're strictly exclusive from each other, then I think that's a problem.
Okay, so you have more of the Buddhist side. So people haven't spoken yet, and thank you, yes.
I think the,
Say your name again?
Nikki?
Nikki?
Yeah, I think the warm cold distinction is kind of interesting because it's like art kind of makes you feel really cool. I think like a loud
Yeah.
table, you know, it's like all relates so cool.
The cold lab table versus how art can make you feel warm. But couldn't there be art that made you scared?
Yeah, that's why it's interesting that they
Yeah. Good. Yeah. What's your
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that going off of what
Jonathan.
Jonathan said about an oversimplification, like I took an issue with imaginative being only artistic.
Good. Yeah.
I think
Why?
to say that there's no imagination in science at all and it only exists in art is absurd.
Yes. And would you say the same symmetrically? To say there's no facts in art is also absurd.
Yeah, I would.
Why?
I think of music, like I play music, and it's all very artistic and like left brain, but there's still facts, and you still have to follow.
Like there's
facts.
theory.
Yeah, music theory is
There's chords.
incredibly difficult to grasp, and it's not all just like you play a note and you make art.
Right. Good. Allison?
So is art only allowed to be these things and science only allowed to be these things?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Well,
Because then you could probably argue that science is like any of those things and art is like any of those things.
yes. Yes.
But that's what you're saying.
No, I'm not saying anything. I'm putting this up to get reactions or responses.
Banksy is anonymous.
Okay, this is, we're getting reactions or, yes, in the back. No, you, yeah. Zoe, yes.
I think the whole distinction between them is wrong because there's so much science in art and science.
Good.
Sometimes we try to make distinctions between them so much that you're like ruining them in a way. Like I know there's artists who use all science to make their art, or
Okay, good.
You know.
Could you say, though, that there is a distinction between, say, forget art and science for a second. Is there a distinction between using your imagination and being factual? Yeah, see, that's the answer that, that one should hear, right? Why do you say no? Given what you just said, that's the answer you should say. Yeah. Because, okay, but hang on. Okay, give me a distinction that you do think is, wait, some of you, okay, hang on, too many thoughts going on here. Forget art and science for a second. Is there a distinction between mystical and empirical, for example? Or do you think mystical experience always involves, say, memory of the past, empirical memory? And even empirical experiences can involve a feeling of the infinite or the mystical. Maria?
I think that like both mystical and empirical come from the same place. So what I mean is like
What's that place?
that you have to acknowledge the similarities in order to acknowledge they're different.
What place?
Like
You said place. Sorry.
I mean, I don't know, it's hard to put into words, but like if everything were different, then we wouldn't have a word for it. You know what I mean? Just how if everything was the same, then I don't know.
Any other? I'm not trying to suggest any. I guess what I'm just trying to do is get you thinking about this, and to see that maybe there could be these families. This is great. Yes, we're getting a lot of discussion. So I'm going to, the four of you in the back, we'll just start with Shahid.
Yeah, I think there's some mystical aspects to science, like, you know, the Big Rip. Like, where did that come from, right? And so,
That's right.
there's
And where's consciousness? Where did consciousness?
exactly.
What is
like, I like to think that, like, science is one of the more beautiful arts, you know? So,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's all relative.
Yeah, and good. There are philosophers who write that science is a kind of art because it's a kind of craft, and it has kind of a rigid procedure to some extent, but there's a lot of flexibility in that procedure. And even art has fairly, standardized techniques. You use certain brushes, I don't know, you use certain materials, you use certain colors that we've agreed on, etc. Yeah, good. And then your hand was up. Yeah, say your name?
Keanu.
Keanu, yeah.
She was saying they have the distinction like play parts in each other, and what that makes stand out for me is the fact that we are able to do the same things, but at the same time, they usually operate as a whole still, and they usually always still have
The distinctions operate as a whole.
yeah, like art and science are within each other.
Oh, art and science are within each other. Sure, yes. I like this. So two more, and then you'll have your break. Yes. Jesus.
Yeah. So, yeah, like whenever I started, when I listed all the distinctions that I can make, I couldn't help but think of the similarities between those distinctions. Like it was like even right now when we're going over art and science, like last quarter I took chemistry class and this quarter I'm taking an art class, and it's really hard for me to distinguish like something which I think they're entirely different. Like we're learning techniques of how to draw, and the last quarter we learned techniques of how to get the temperature of a certain chemical reaction. There's like a certain process, and each of them is some delivery. And to kind of go off from what Maria was saying about the place where this all comes from, I think, I'm going to just take a guess. I'm not sure if I can really call it a place, but I would say that curiosity is where all of this is like the place where all of this comes from. You have a desire to get answers, or to at least, ask questions to possibly get somewhere, which is kind of the point of philosophy, is to ask a question. I mean, in the end, you're going to end up with more questions, that's inevitable. But even from that, there's like some kind of pleasure from it, whether it is, through finding out some factual evidence or creating some beautiful masterpiece we look at every day.
Good. I really think, thank you, Jesus. You helped me understand really this comment a bit better. There is this place of curiosity. I really like that way of putting it. Yeah, and that's something, never forget it. I mean, it's so hard, it's so easy to forget it if, whatever it is you'll end up doing in your life. But there are many jobs that'll beat it out of you and you won't think about it. And even supposedly scientific or artistic jobs, it becomes very rigid. It becomes very rigid. And so, yeah, this point of curiosity is a very important one. Yeah, I like it. Yeah. And your name? Yeah.
Andrea?
Andrea.
I was just gonna say that in terms of empirical, I feel like even within that, it still falls under the framework of frameworks that were human created, and it's kind of interesting how in the sciences is always separating himself from the physical and what he's observing, when in fact a lot of that data, even though it's very controlled within standards and measurements and stuff, even those measurements were human created, so it's still very depending on the perspective of that particular, it has to do with the instruments too that were man-made. So I don't know.
Sure.
That was just a thought.
I do want to rescue a little bit of objectivity in science. Anyway, yes. Agreed. Sort of. I didn't put subjectivity and objectivity up there. I could have. Yeah, I did. They were should I do this before the break? Now, why don't you have your break now? So I'm going to talk just a tad about structure and dynamics of distinctions, but I'm not going to make too much of a big deal out of this. Take any distinction, and it may not work for all distinctions, but any of the ones we just did now, I don't know, imaginative, factual, or something. Okay. I think there's kind of a spectrum in how these two poles, these two entities in the distinction, factual, imaginative, or love, anger, to use yours, there's a spectrum that they can go from being dualism, which means that they sort of exclude, well actually you need both. How did I do this? I didn't bring it with me, did I? I'm being a little confused now. It's late in the day. Interpenetration means you need both of them and that they both are part of the other. And you've already said that on, say, art and science. So art and science is an example of interpenetration. Either or means you need one or, you can only have one or the other. And I'm trying to remember dualism. I might have done it metaphysically. I might have done it ontologically, but I can't remember. Yeah, why can't I? I didn't bring it with me. Oh well, maybe I'll just skip this slide.
Makes sense to me.
Makes sense to who?
Like you can either have red or yellow, but they're not opposites like dualism.
Yeah. It's something like that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. But it's an either or.
But either or. Yeah, sorry, I'm just boy. So, and I wrote this fucking paper. These are diagrams from a paper I wrote and I submitted, I've gotten critiques, but you know, they wanted to see a second version of it, and I haven't done a second version. But I realized that that's one thing, one of the list of 17 things I had to do today was review the figure captions of these figures, and I just forgot to do it. So, okay. But it's something I wrote, which makes it all the more embarrassing. But this I can do, this down here. What do you do with a distinction? One is it can just stay the same. Or you can do what Hegel did, which is what he called Aufhebung, which is synthesis, where you can go from X or not X to X and X. X and not X. So you take the two and sort of put them together. Okay? And what, yeah, now I vaguely remember as I'm explaining this. I do remember. What is going on up here is what happens when you only have the distinctions, you keep the distinctions somehow. Because the thing is, even with interpenetration, you still have the poles. They're still mutually defining. Okay? It's not like you have gone beyond and said that there's actually like a greater whole or something. You're still keeping each pole. Actually, this is too hard. You should read the paper. Sorry, I'm not going to do this right now. It's too... there is a method to the madness, but I can't. It's too late. I want to just see pictures. Okay. So another way to think about how we, of course, I think in terms of maps often, but how we can like classify or how we can make distinctions. Distinctions aren't just like a two-way distinction. Sometimes you can have three or multiple way distinctions. Then they're called trichotomies or quadrichotomies or quintichotomies, whatever. Or instead of a dualism, you can have a trilism. Okay? Now, it's this kind of a funky article that you can go read down here. My favorite book on maps is called Strange Maps. You can buy it on Amazon for 20 bucks. This guy, I want to meet him. He's a crazy dude, but I like him. I love him. He lives in London, though. Maybe I'll go visit. I'm going to London in May, so maybe I should never thought of it. Yeah, I'll contact him. Okay, so he made, with this one nice article, he says that it's kind of crazy, but it kind of makes sense, that all countries have 5 basic shapes. There's 5 basic shapes you can fit a country into. You can say it's compact, which means it's basically just like a sort of a spherical thing. The U.S. is compact, very rough. It's prorupt. That means that you can't like really force everything into one. I guess if you abstract away Florida, it's compact, but Florida's kind of small compared to the entire size of the country. Elongated is like Chile or Norway. They're just very long. Fragmented, many countries, but every country that has an archipelago, which is actually many countries in this world. The Philippines, Denmark, Italy to some extent. Italy is actually both fragmented and elongated. So you can actually have both, 2 or so. Or the one that many of you don't think about, there can be countries completely surrounded by another country. Give me an example. Palestine. No, Switzerland is not, because that's Austria on one side, Germany upstairs, France to the left. The Vatican is a great example. The Vatican is officially a country, and it's completely surrounded by Italy. Okay? But in South Africa, there is a country called Lesotho, which is totally within South Africa. Yes? What?
I was saying that.
Oh, Lesotho? Yeah, right. And then he puts, oh, it's right here, Lesotho. Yeah, perforated. Or compact is Cambodia, protruded is Thailand, Vietnam is elongated, and the Philippines is fragmented. The reason, apart from the fact that I love maps, but I just think this is a fascinating classification because then I went to the globe. I have a globe in my home office. I went at the globe and I actually looked at, of course, you look at the different countries, and yeah, most countries fit into one of these 5 or multiples of these 5 schemes. And there's kind of something weird about that. It's almost mystical experience because you realize it seems such a bizarre classification scheme, but it works. And I don't know, there's just something so interesting that, over 250 countries can all be squeezed into 1 or maybe 2, sometimes 3 of these. Yeah.
Can you think of maybe like a totally alternate scheme that would also work? Like,
Great question.
Like,
Great question.
couldn't you just because you implemented this one in your mind, because a circle you wouldn't necessarily. I just feel like you're cool enough to maybe come up with an alternate.
Yeah. So yeah, that's true.
But maybe
I'll
not
think about
because this
that.
one's already been embedded,
Okay, you've thrown down the gauntlet. Yeah. I will come up with 1.2. Yes. Incidentally, for any of you interested in fractals, how many of you are interested in fractals or self-similarity? Okay, that Mandelbrot got some of his ideas from reading a guy. Mandelbrot is one of the founders of fractals, yes? He wrote a paper, Mandelbrot wrote a paper in the late 60s called How Long is the Coastline of Britain? And it's actually, there's no determinate answer to that question. Because it depends with what scale, with what measuring rod you're using. If you're using like a 1 meter measuring rod, you're not going to be able to get every nook and cranny. Whereas if you're using, say, a 1 centimeter measuring rod, you'll be able to get a lot more of the curvature and it'll be much longer. So it depends on what measuring rod you're using. And this idea Mandelbrot used to develop fractals, but he got that idea from a geographer who had already written a paper where he had made this point. Anyway, little nerdy footnote there. Yeah. We're nerds. So at least some of us. And it's not, or do you say geek or nerd? I don't know anymore. Sure, I can try to come up with another scheme. The point I just want you to take home is that this is a kind of knife. Well, they kind of look like knives. That looks like a cleaver. And that looks like a knife. And that looks like some knife coming at you, maybe, as it's very close. That looks like you after an encounter with a knife. Or you after an encounter with a knife. Okay. So another way to think, I'm just thinking about ways to cut, or ways, different classification schemes, or different ways to sort of go outside of our ordinary kind of thinking. That's why I do like this classification scheme, despite Amy's skepticism. Because I think it's at least interesting to think of all these sort of bizarre shapes that countries have, but to classify them under only 5 types. Amy, not right now. Sorry. Okay. It's just a boundary, right? Just down the middle or whatever, and that's it. But no, you can actually have funky kinds of boundaries where the same country or city, I can send you the full page for this. But like a country could have what's called an enclave inside of another country next to it. And it's still the same country, but it's not the same country. It's not geographically connected, but it is the same country because they're under the same jurisdiction. Okay? Or it could just kiss like this. Or it could be like there, but it's actually within 2 countries. Etc., etc. And he has cases. He found this dude, Frank Jacobs is his name, found examples for every single one of these different cases. Or like a country like Gambia, which is a country in Africa, which is completely surrounded, I think by, is it Ghana? I can't remember right now. And then, and it's out to the ocean.
The blue is all water.
Blue is all water, sorry, yeah. Blue is water. And then whether it's green, yellow, or gray means a different country. And sometimes it can be shared space or obviously demilitarized space. Neutral ground. My only point here is to just, what you think of as so natural a boundary. And just think about, like, you know, darkness and light. I mean, all these boundaries are just so important to our way of thinking. And, you know, the boundaries of a culture, our boundaries of knowledge, the boundaries of science, etc. And we tend to think that, you know, it's just a binary thing. Either you're inside or you're outside, etc. But this is meant to sort of question, invite questioning about it. Yeah, Nikki.
Can you kind of relate this to like gerrymandering? You know, like we do it, we like create boundaries to like accomplish our own goals and kind of like.
Yeah, I like that. So maybe you're using gerrymandering, as I'm sure you know, usually has a negative connotation in politics, right? Because you try to change the voting area so that if you're in a Republican state, then you try to do it so that you get just enough Republicans in this total, in all these little areas, but you're also excluding all the Democrats. So it usually has negative connotation, but I like this positive connotation, where you are finding your own way to negotiate these distinctions, or make like little mini countries or something in the space of knowledge or the space of emotions. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. And by the way, there are a lot of map tattoos on the internet. I googled map tattoo. There's a lot.
It looks like scar tissue.
What?
It looks like scar tissue.
Oh, I don't know these things, okay. All right. Possibly. What time is it?
33.
33? Give me 1 minute. So we have, yeah, it's good. I'm almost done. We will finish. Fancy that. I give a lecture, we actually finish. What did I just do?
What are you trying to do?
Just view it. Don't close it.
Okay. This might be too much for now, and I'll accept it if it's too much, and you tell me to shut up and I'll stop. This might be too much. This represents any what's called taxonomic hierarchy in logical space. Okay? What you do is you have the biggest category, like being. And in being, you divide into, say, spiritual things and material things. And in spiritual things, you divide, I don't know, into gods and angels and such. And material things, you divide into living and non-living, and so forth and so forth, okay? This is called a taxonomic hierarchy, which is actually very important in logic and in concepts and conceptualization. And I like this picture because it shows that there can be many, many levels, up to n levels. And at the bottom, you have the most concrete, or the most, like every possible color or something like that at the bottom. Okay. And many in nature, I mean, this gets back to knife and the one. It gets back to prickles and goose. This is a very prickly way of thinking. Okay. And this is what modern logic, modern math, a lot of science is sort of based on. It's a very like rigid distinction-making machine. And some things, even in nature, fit this very nicely. Like, never mind what the letters mean, they're just different conventions for how to name different kinds of stars. But these are different kinds of stars according to a certain system. And it actually works rather nicely. The ideal classification system has three properties. Mutually exclusive categories at the end, collectively exhaustive, and is systematic. As I said, I know this is kind of a little out there, but Zerubbabel gets at some of these things in the reading you were supposed to do for him, in addition to my 901. And I will get to Zerubbabel in a second also. But it's just, I just think it's important in the liberal arts college that some professor at some point has told you what a classification system is supposed to be. Collectively exhaustive categories and mutually exclusive categories. And then whatever classification principles there are have been applied systematically. That's sort of like that's the core of a classification system. This is great for stars, etc. But life gets messy even with biology. I really like this diagram. Again, these are just single letters, but for those of you who are in biology, you might recognize them as amino acids. These are the single letters for the amino acids. The 20, 21, depending on how you count, 22 sometimes amino acids. And then they're clustered using Venn diagrams according to their various properties. Are they charged or not charged? Are they polar or not polar? Are they aromatic or not aromatic, etc. And when you start doing that, it's very hard. It's easy to do this if you're only looking at like one property or a very small set of distinctions. But it's very hard to do that kind of neat, non-overlapping, mutually exclusive classification, like with stars, when you're looking at things that have multiple properties, like amino acids.
So they're forced to put G in 2 places?
Yeah, I was just noticing that. I hadn't noticed that before, that they put G in 2 places. I agree. I don't know what to make of that. Let's try to ignore that for now. I will look into it. Yes. I mean, each one is only supposed to be in one place. So the point is, this is the ideal. This is the philosophical ideal of classification. It's sort of a logical ideal of classification. It works well for some things, not so well for others. Okay? So just like our distinctions sort of can work, they work pretty well sometimes. But there's all kinds of places where they fail, and there's all kinds of places where they're the wrong way to think about things, or we just have the wrong distinction, or we're not sharing our distinctions. We don't have a language of sharing distinctions. By the way, if you want, I think a really good book on many of these things, even though it's a very nice book, but it's a bit weird. I like it. It's called Sorting Things Out. By Boker and Starr. Anyway, if you have any interest, they look at classifications in hospitals, how people get classified and reclassified. They've looked at classification and reclassification under apartheid in South Africa, and that's a fascinating chapter. A guy was reclassified 7 times because he went to court all the time because he wanted to change classification so he could stay married with his wife. And then something turned up in the history of his wife, etc. But it's about classification and the politics of classification. I'm going to skip that. And this is the last slide. So the first part of the talk today, of the sort of the lecture or whatever you want to call it today, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what the structure of these distinctions are. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about whether we discover or create. The 3 questions I have in the piece. I forget the exact way I put it. Does anyone have the piece on there? Yeah, can I borrow that for a second? Thank you. Yeah, I like it to see it all marked up and everything. That's good. How clean is each cut? Yeah, that was the thing about thinking about a spectrum, or thinking about whether we could get over the distinction, could we synthesize? So the first question is now, how clean is each cut? The second question is, do the knife cuts follow pre-existing fault lines in reality? Do we carve nature at its joints? I skipped that question for now. And third is, who owns the knife and how did they build it? So one way to think about who owns the knife, I just want to, here are 3 metaphors. And that was in the Zerubbabel reading. Thank you, or at least part of it. We can think of the rigid mind as seeing difference everywhere. and insisting that there's difference everywhere. The rigid mind loves, adores, and builds distinctions and sees them everywhere. The fuzzy mind just sees a field of variation. Everything is different. Things are just all kind of their own thing, or nominalism, as philosophers might call nominalism. There aren't any strong distinctions. The distinctions change. The distinctions change depending on who you're talking to, etc. And the flexible mind combines both. The flexible mind, according to Zerubbabel, is something or someone who knows when to be rigid and when to be flexible. These concepts, but I personally find them to be very useful ways to think about how we think about cutting up the world and making distinctions and classifying. The rigid mind loves distinctions, the fuzzy mind detests them. The fuzzy mind lives in the twilight zones, as Zerubbabel says. And the flexible mind combines the two. Are there any comments or questions about this particular idea of Zerubbabel and what you did in the reading? No? Are you as tired as I am?
Yes.
Good.
Probably more.
I will bite my tongue. It's not particularly nice. Okay. All right. Let's stop there. So, see you Tuesday. And this was the last lecture I did, really. Now we have guest lecture.